You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Welcome again if we haven't met. My name's Scott. I'm one of the pastors here and excited to get to share with you this morning. Every Sunday we walk through different books of the Bible or passages on a Sunday morning. That's what our sermon is, kind of looking at different passages and seeking to apply those to our lives. And for the past 3 months, we've been stuck on the same 3 verses. So we're just going real deep. But we're really trying to take these 3 verses, take the Great Commission and apply it deeply to our lives, and really just kind of to knit it into the fabric of our lives, not simply kind of go out and apply it, but knit it into the fabric of our lives. In Matthew 28, 18 through 20, Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age." So we talked about the fact that in order to make disciples, you have to first be a disciple. And actually, in large swaths, I mean, we've said this before, but this started, over 6 months ago when we started walking through the entire Bible, walking through the entire Old Testament, walking through the story of the New Testament, and that call that culminates in this call for us to make disciples. And if this season has been a blessing for you, if this has been something that's been real. It's just encouraging, maybe eye-opening or transformative to you. This is actually part of why we really encourage you to take perspectives. I think that's like the next step in this story. It's taking that story, following that story through, and understanding how that story's being written, both across our world and across our city. But we talked about in our meditation on this Great Commission, we've talked about the fact that in order to make disciples, you have to first be a disciple. We talked about what it means to walk with disciples, teaching them to observe all that Christ commanded. And for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about what it means to invite new disciples, that they might be reconciled to God, and as it says in the Commission, baptized into His family. Now, for those of you who are here, maybe you're visiting today, maybe you've just been visiting the last few weeks, and you're not yet a disciple of Christ, I want to explain just real briefly why we're doing this. Because we're not trying to figure out how we as Christians can manipulate you into our fold. Right? We're not trying to trick you. We're not trying to figure out ways that we can build a bigger church, because that's what's important. What we're doing and why we talk about kind of how to love those outside of the church is the same reason we spent 4 weeks talking about how to love each other inside of the church. And that's because all of us, we fall short of living out a life like Jesus, and we need to learn how to just how to be good friends. We do. Even as Christians, and I'll confess to you, as Christians, it doesn't come naturally. I mean, maybe there's 1% of you that it comes really naturally to. The rest of us, we just tend to be selfish, and we need to be reminded and encouraged and called to just learn how to be good friends. And secondly, because the reason we want to share these things with you is because this is the deepest part of who we are. The deepest part of how we understand God and the world, and we believe with all of our hearts that a part of just being human together in life is sharing the deepest parts of ourselves with one another. Being honest about that and caring about that so that we can engage with one another in that level. And so we're going to talk about just practical things we can do as Christians to love those around us, and I just want to clarify, especially if you're not familiar with this, that's part of that. That's really at the core of why we're talking about these things, and particularly talking about them today. Last week, Matt highlighted the fact that we're called to be ambassadors. I loved the picture he gave. We can choose to live in LA either as I was going to say vacationers, but that wasn't the right word. What did he use? Tourists, that was it. I'm it's something like that. It was so impactful. No, but it was actually a thought that carried with me throughout this week, right? That we can either be tourists or we can be ambassadors, right? And God has called us to live as ambassadors. And in addition to this imagery of being ambassadors, Jesus also provided with a whole host of different analogies as well to just try to help us understand what this life is meant to be. And two of the most well-known analogies are that he's called us to be salt and light. It's in Matthew chapter 5, towards the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says to his disciples, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good work and glorify and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." So in identifying our place in the world, we need to recognize the difference. And as we think about this, salt and light, I think it's helpful for us to recognize the difference between what Christ means by being salt and light, and I think sometimes what the culture sees with it. I actually think it's become pretty unpopular for us to talk about how we're salt and light. Right? Usually when you talk about somebody being the salt of the world, it's more like an old grizzled man talking about being the salt of the earth. Right? We're just the salt of the earth people. Right? But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. And we've kind of gotten away from this, and I think part of it is because of the cultural perception of Christians. Right? How the kind of world views Christians. And it's not as this like salt and light beneficial, right? Oftentimes the world views Christians as closed-minded, angry, right? Detrimental to progress in the world. And while there are, unfortunately, some who claim Christ who are, frankly, poor ambassadors and do represent him that way, and there are some, not some of us, there are probably all of us that at moments represent him that way as well, that's not what it is actually like to know a Christian. Right? To be engaged and love and be, and Christ calls us to be something different, to actually be salt and light in the world. And this toxic minority, whether it's of people or even of our own experiences, doesn't accurately reflect the experience of what God intends for it to be to know a sincere Christian. Which leads us to the fact that the single greatest way to combat the misperception that people have about Christians, right? Sometimes we're like, how do we fix this? Like, how do we like make this not the way that people perceive Christians? Well, the single best way is for us as Christians to simply engage with those around us and love them. We can't, you and I individually can't change a cultural narrative. But we can absolutely transform a perspective of a person who we come in contact with and live life with and deeply engage with. You see, personal experience, a person's personal experience with you can overcome all the misinformation they've ever heard about Christians. Right? It doesn't matter if you've been taught your entire life that salt is tasteless. It only takes one taste to be convinced. Right? It doesn't matter if you've been told all your life that the light is worthless and doesn't help you see anything. It only takes one moment of illumination to realize the truth. Right? You can overcome this. We can overcome this in people's lives simply by engaging and being with them. Which is why he tells us, you are the salt of the world. And salt does a few different things, right? One of the things salt does is it flavors food. Right? And you provide a doorway to experiencing the vibrant and exciting life Christ offers as an alternative to the boring, routine, lonely existence that's the norm of people, and particularly even here in West LA. Right? I mean, every Friday night, restaurants and bars are packed with people looking for a fix. Right? Some type of excitement to like pull them out of the doldrums, to like pull them out, to make all this like boring existence worth it. They're looking for some excitement, some connection, but what they don't realize is they're longing for Jesus. They're longing for saltiness. And you are here as the salt of the world. Salt also preserves food. And transformed by Christ, you and I actually also provide a constant grace and blessing that is preserving to the families, relationships, schools, workplaces around us. These all flourish better because of the presence of you and I in them. At least that's how Christ has called us and designed us to be. Right? When the project at work completely goes off the rails and everyone is panicking and morale is at an all-time low and all anybody can do is complain and things seem completely worthless, your work ethic, your eternal perspective, your joy in the midst of that can have a significant impact on your team and can even be the difference between your team getting through this incredibly difficult project and the team completely imploding. Right? This is who God's called us to be the salt of the world, and not only that, but to also be the light of the world. He says light, to put most simply, illuminates, right? It shows, it demonstrates. As someone who has been transformed, God has placed you here to illuminate the world with love, grace, mercy, and the truth of Christ. Right? When depression, despair, anxiety, fear, worry, insecurity overwhelm your neighbors, your presence in their life can shine the light of Christ into their darkness. You can offer them real hope when all they've ever experienced before is temporary reprieve, right? We have an opportunity to not only be the salt, but to be the light. But what's interesting about this is that neither our saltiness nor our light kind of comes from ourselves, right? I think that's why sometimes we're like, man, I don't feel up for that, right? But the light we possess is a reflective light. Right? It doesn't pour from ourselves. It's a reflective light. It's kind of like the moon, right? The moon shines, but the moon itself doesn't actually produce any of that light. All that we see in the shining that comes from the moon is the reflection of the sun's light upon it, right? And we see that reflection, and we get to benefit from the light of that. And some of you are like, I don't get to benefit from the light of the moon, right? Like here in the city, it's like this like glowing orb. You're like, okay. Have you ever been somewhere that's like actually really dark, like outside of the city, like really dark? Moonlight is incredible. I think sometimes we get discouraged because we're like, well, I'm not the sun, like how am I supposed to make a difference in this world? And Jesus is like, no, like that's me, right? Like, but you're supposed to point people to me. You're supposed to demonstrate what it's like to come from me. You're supposed to reflect the ultimate light who is me. But as you reflected light can still be incredibly powerful light. In pitch blackness, if a full moon is shining in the sky, like, you can drive a car down a windy road by moonlight alone. I'm not saying you should go try that, but I mean you absolutely can. Like you don't need headlights. Like in a full moon night, you do not need headlights to drive a car. You can read a book under moonlight. Like, and some of you are like, what? Right? But you just got to get out of the city. Like, just go, even if it's the middle of the desert. Like, it's a beautiful thing. It's incredible how much light, I mean, it really is actually kind of like shocking how much light the moon can provide on a dark night. And the same is true of you and me. And how much more are we meant to be impactful in a world that is especially as the world darkens around us. So how do you take reflective light that you and I are and put it on a lampstand, right? How do you, he says this is his command, right? But don't put it under a basket, put it on a lampstand. And you're like, okay, I won't put a basket on or something. Okay, I'll stand tall and I don't know, how do I do that, right? Well, what does that actually look like? And this is actually the main point I want to talk about today. And instead of convincing you that you're an ambassador, because I think you already know that, instead of convincing you that you're the salt of the world, because I think you already know that, instead of convincing you that you're the light of the world, because I think you know that, I want to seek to answer this one simple question that this passage raises. How do you obey Jesus' command to not hide your light under a basket but put it on a lampstand? How do we do that? Because you could walk out of here going like, okay, I need to shine, but you don't need to shine. Like, you are light. You are the light of the world. Like, you don't, like, that's who you are. You are the salt. He says, he's not saying go be that more. He's just saying stop hiding it, but put it on display. So how do we do, what are some practical steps we can take to obey that right here in West LA? Well, first, I think it's important to help us identify what's one of the most like significant baskets we put on our light, right? If he says don't hide it under a basket, like what are the baskets? And while there might be a lot of theoretical barriers or baskets like isolation or busyness or fear, and we could focus on all of those, I actually just want to focus on one. I just want to focus on what I actually think is the most significant, not theoretical barrier, but just the most significant physical barrier between that creates a basket out of which our light doesn't shine. And I think for many of us, the most significant basket is actually our home, our house, or our apartment. I mean, in our culture, home is a sanctuary, right? Home, it's the epitome of your private space. It's the place that is for you and for no one else, and that it's where you go to retreat. It's where you go to literally keep everything else out, and it's the thing that keeps light from getting out, right? And this is what's normal in our culture. Everyone hurries into their apartment or their house trying to make contact with as few people as possible, right? Like they start getting nervous if they even have to like say hi to the mail carrier, right? Just get me inside so that I can just, not have to deal with everything out here. And after a while, when we live in apartment buildings like this, when we live in neighborhoods like this, we look around and we go, oh, okay, I guess that's how you live. And so we adopt it and we start to live the same way. But when that is how you view your home, the result is that it becomes the most significant physical basket in our lives. Unless you're regularly inviting others into your home, your four walls are functioning as a basket, hiding your light from the world around you. So, but what do we do about it? Right? Well, I said I wanted to get really practical. So we're going to look at 4 steps you can take starting this week to get your light out from under the basket of your apartment or your home and put it on a lampstand. And since your home is the most significant basket we're talking about today, we're going to look at 4 steps of stepping outside your basket in the process of engaging your neighbors, like your actual physical neighbors. And this could apply to your coworkers as well. Maybe for you, your office space is actually your basket, and so you could apply this maybe to your coworkers then. Maybe it's your cubicle. Maybe it's something else. You can apply it to your friends. And so there's different applications here, but I'm going to focus in on just kind of use as an example. It's kind of a primary example, your actual home and your physical neighbors. I think when Jesus was asked, when he told him, you're called to love your neighbor as yourself, and he was asked, well, who's my neighbor? He answered with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what he was communicating was your neighbor is anyone around you who you walk past and is in need. And I would venture to guess that the people we walk past in the greatest need every day are the people that we share walls with, share neighborhoods with, that are in need, that are hurting, but that we, like the first 2 characters in the parable of the Good Samaritan, usually walk right past because we have other things we need to do. So, 4 steps in kind of stepping out from underneath the basket, putting your light on a lampstand particularly in the context of your neighborhood. Step 1, okay? Identify your neighbors. I'd say, this isn't going to be that hard. You thought this was going to be really you thought this was going to be complicated. Step 1 is, who are your neighbors, right? And it may seem overly basic, but do you know the names of the people who live in the 10 closest dwellings to your apartment or your house? Do you know the names of the people who live in the 5 closest? Right, here's what I was going to give you this as homework, but actually we're going to do this. We're going to do this together right now. Grab a pen. You got a sheet there, or there's little pads of paper in front of you. We're going to do this together. I want you to draw a map of your either apartment building or your neighborhood. It can be, so, if you're an architectural type, you can draw like actual footprints of houses. If you're like me, just draw some squares, right? And so put it here. Here's me. Right, this is where I live, and I'm gonna do this with you, okay? So here's me. So now what I want you to do is I want you to draw the 5 closest dwellings to your place. And if you don't have a pen, you can do this mentally. But I want you to draw the 5 closest dwellings to you, and then in those boxes, I want you to write the names of the people that the names of the people who live there, and see how many of your neighbors you actually know. Here, I'm gonna do this too, so we'll just take a second here. Okay. So, my map's got 4 for 5. And our first step here is if your map has any gaps in it, then you know how you can apply the first step, right? This is where you start. Like, what are the neighbors? I should have done that on the back of my notes with a Sharpie. I'm like, oh, I'm going to use one that I already used, but then I forgot that we have another service. That's fine. Yeah, right, and just now you know how you can apply step 1, right? Who you need to identify, and for some of you, you might actually think that this is impossibly hard. And to be fair, there might be some particular neighbors that this is particularly hard for. I'll say like the gap on my map is like it's like this particular relationship where like it's been more difficult than it's been for other neighbors, even like just to get to know them much at all. But there are numerous simple things you can do that are going to open up open up the opportunity for you to know who your neighbors are. I mean, really, like step 1, just say hi, right? Like that's one thing you can do. Like be outside, right? Go for walks. Like instead, right? Go for just be outside. Walk around your neighborhood. Do you realize that if you went on like just a couple of walks a week, over the course of the year, there is a 0% chance you wouldn't know every single one of your neighbors who owns a dog. Right? Like, they have to be out. I mean, unless they want a bunch of dog poop in their house, they have to be outside multiple times a day. Right? So, like, all we need to do is just be outside, make a batch of cookies, right? Even if you're in an apartment full of single guys, just make a batch of cookies, and you might want to test them first. That's what, like, maybe you should have somebody taste test them, and then give them to your neighbors. Maybe, but even if they're bad, now you have something to talk about, right? You have a shared experience. Right? Throw a block party, right? Throw a building party, right? Throw an open house. I mean, do you have any idea how much less lonely our city would be if Christians were in the habit of throwing parties, if all the Christians in the city were in the habit of throwing parties for their neighbors? If we just did that. If all we did was say, once or twice a year, it's just normal for Christians to throw a party for their neighbors, did you have any idea how less lonely our city would be? And so when you're tempted to hurry inside, shut the door, ignore the world, we all just need simple reminders to be engaged and to love those literally, all right? So here, I'm also going to give you like a real simple reminder, right, that might help remind you. Maybe it'll just haunt you. Either way, it's fine. I'm cool with that. You know that song, like, This Little Light of Mine, right? Like, and probably 90% of you, probably right, this little light of mine, what I want you to do, every day when you get out of your car, I just want you to start humming that song in your head. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, right? And because by the time you get to the front, right about when you get to your front door, you're gonna get to the part where it sings, hide it under a bushel. No, right? which is going to get you to go on your walk. Because you're going to have to think to yourself, hide it under a bushel. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Right? Like, so now you just take that little reminder, walk it with you, take it with a grain of salt. All right. That one's for free. All right, so the first step is identify your neighbors and who your neighbors are. Second step, really complicated too. Are you ready? Pray for your neighbors. Right? Pray for your neighbors. Like, just now you know their names, so now pray for them. Right? Come before God. There's no greater way to bless your neighborhood than to be the one person who is regularly, consistently, compassionately lifting up each one of these people in prayer. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, I mean, most of my non-Christian friends, I'm the only Christian they know. Which means for most of my non-Christian friends, I'm going to be the only person praying for them at all. Like, both in, like, for their heart, but also just for their life. Can you imagine going through life devoid of prayer, having no one ever pray for you and never praying? Like, I mean, can you imagine? Like, do you realize there's a huge blessing we can be to our neighbor? How would our city be different if we just took the simple step to pray for our neighbors? It's also a great way to maintain interest and care for your neighbors, right? Because you're regularly thinking about them, you're regularly praying for them, right? You want an easy way to help remember somebody's name? Pray for them regularly, right? If you have trouble remembering their name, right? I mean, if we're not praying for our neighbors, our efforts to share Christ with them are simply acts of empty self-righteousness, right? Because we're not dependent upon God and leading them to Him. We're just trying to fulfill our duty or the thing, check off the list of the thing we're supposed to do. But when it comes to praying for our non-Christian friends, I mean, there's a couple of different questions that often pop up in our heads. And the first question is, okay, if I'm praying for my non-Christian friends, what should I pray for? Right? Like, should I pray for the things that they're asking for? Or should I pray for, like, their heart? Like, how do I, like, should I, if your neighbor's battling a difficult disease, do you pray for their healing? Or do you pray that they would come to know Christ? Like, do you pray, if your neighbor's an alcoholic, do you pray for them to stop drinking? Or do you pray for them to have the love for Christ replace this idol in their heart? If your neighbor desperately wants to get pregnant, did you pray for God to bless them with a child? Or do you pray, God, I want them to become Christians so they'd be Christian parents so they could raise this child? And I understand these types of questions. I mean, I've asked them myself, but the truth is that if you look closely at these questions, they don't actually make much sense. I mean, do you have a prayer limit? Like, I don't have a prayer limit. Like, God didn't tell me I only get 3 for every person, right? Like, I don't have that, like, why can't you compassionately ask for all these things for the people in your life? Why can't you ask for God to heal disease in somebody that doesn't know Him yet? Well, why don't we ask Him to stop their drinking? Right? Why don't we ask Him to allow them the gift of a child? Why don't we ask them for all these things and ask for God to grab a hold of their hearts and open their eyes to His truth and transform their lives from the inside out? To also beg God to reveal Himself to them and grant them faith to believe in Him. And there's all sorts of different questions we could ask. I mean, we can't address all the different questions about prayer and prayer for people. But the other question I get, in one sense, like, this makes sense kind of on the front end, but the other question I think I get, and that also comes up in my mind, is like, okay, so but for how long? Right? I mean, some of you are, LA is a transient area, and some of you have, lived in your places like less than a couple of years. Some of you have lived in your place. Some of you have had the same neighbors for years and years. Some of you have had the same neighbors for decades and decades. Like how long? I mean, at some point, should I just be like, okay, God, you know what I want. I'm just going to move on to, something else. But God calls us to persistent prayer. He calls us actually to come to Him again and again and again, even sometimes with the same things, to pray for them as long as we know them and have breath and have ability. Jesus explained this in a parable. In Luke 11, he talks about how there's There's a man and a friend of his comes to visit him, but the visitor comes at midnight. He gets in right at the end of a long journey, he gets in at midnight, and the host, realizes he doesn't have any food for him, right? He's here at the end of a long journey, and his friend needs food. I mean, he's hungry, and he's coming to a house, and he's like, oh my gosh, I don't have anything to offer you. And this is, right, like this is before fast food, right? This is before the grocery store. This is before Eat 24, right? Like if you don't have food in the house, you don't have food, right? Like there's nowhere else to go. So what does he do? He goes to the only place available where he could possibly get food, which is his neighbor. And he knocks on his neighbor's door, maybe even like knocks on his window, right? Wakes up because it's the middle of the night and says, my friend just came from a long journey. Will you give me just a couple of loaves of bread to feed him? And his neighbor says, go away. It's the middle of the night. I'll give you some food in the morning. But the man standing outside realizes he doesn't have any other option. There's nowhere else to go. There's nothing else to do. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you keep knocking until he gives you bread, right? And he says, why does the neighbor give him bread? Because he kept knocking, right? He says, I'm just knocking and knocking and knocking and knocking, and eventually, he says, eventually your neighbor's going to give you bread. He says, if that's so much like a heartless neighbor, he goes, how much more the love of God? And we can't get into the depths of this and how and why God answers prayers. There is a mystery there that I don't understand. I'll just confess to you. At the same time, persistent prayer does not belittle God. Persistent prayer does not annoy God. Persistent prayer glorifies God. Us coming to him again and again and again and again and again and saying, Lord, I don't have anywhere else to go. There's no other place I can go to get what I desire. Lord, I have to come to you. God loves persistent prayer, and he also loves to answer persistent prayer. Again, there's mystery in that. I know there's mystery in that. That could be a whole sermon series in and of itself. But the parable, at the very least, absolutely wants to teach us that. But just as we're called to pray for our neighbors, we're also called to take opportunities to be the answer to prayer for them. Sometimes God provides you with an opportunity to be the answer to the prayer you've been praying. Right? Sometimes God provides you with an opportunity to be the answer to the prayer that somebody's been praying on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. Somebody else has been praying for them, and God placed them and orchestrated them right next to, in your life, living right next to you so that you might be an answer to the prayer, and so that we might shine our light to them, and which is why we're called to invest our lives so that they might be illuminated by that light. Which brings us to the third step, right? So identify your neighbors, pray for your neighbors, and thirdly, just get to know your neighbors. Like get to move beyond their name, right? Move beyond their name to know them, to know their concerns, to know their interests, to know their desires, to know their passions. But more than anything, just get to know their story. Like, do you know your neighbor's stories? Do you know who they are? Do you know why? Do you know why they have that thing hanging on their apartment door? Do you know why they drive that car? Do you know why kids come and show up randomly, right, every few weeks, but aren't normally there, right? Did you know why? Do you know their stories? After learning their names and beginning to pray for them, listen to them, ask them questions, engage them, enter into their worlds. The reality is, we know how to do this, right? I mean, you know how to enter into somebody. You know how to be a good friend. We talked about this even for 4 weeks before, about how to do this with one another. It's just taking that type of love and applying it to those around us as well, to engage into their lives and to care about them. To not just know their names, but to actually be a friend. Right? And this is true. This is an opportunity you have whether you're going to be here for the next 30 years or whether you're going to be here just for the next 3 months. Even if you're only going to be here for the next 3 months, you have an opportunity to engage and be with people. And let me just maybe take this opportunity to say, please don't let the fact that your neighbors have different morals or a different lifestyle or a different worldview from you stand in the way of you taking time to really get to know them, right? That's the barrier we're supposed to be crossing, right? Like that's what it means. Like we should assume that if you don't know Jesus, I should assume that you have different morals than me. I should assume that you have a different lifestyle than me. I should assume that you have a different worldview from me. That shouldn't be the thing that stands in the way. That shouldn't be the barrier between us that I'm not willing to push through to really get to know you. Right? Just because your neighbor smokes pot, and I'm not singling that out as like the worst sin in the world or something like that, but like think about it, right? Just because your neighbor smokes pot doesn't mean you shouldn't sit in their apartment with them and learn about their guitar collection. Right? Just because your neighbor is, and we talked about this yesterday, just because your neighbor's gay doesn't mean you shouldn't have him and his husband over for dinner. Right? Just because your neighbor thinks Christians are idiots doesn't mean you shouldn't invite them to your party. Right? Of course all these things are different. Right? Of course that's the case. These are the barriers where we're called to cross in love. And this sounded great in my study, and I got nervous all of a sudden as it was coming out last service, but I think it's really important. Also, please don't use your kids as an excuse to avoid people who are different from you. Don't use being afraid that you don't want to expose your kids to something to be the excuse that gets in the way. See, and I'm not advocating for exposing your kids to things they can't process yet. There's a time and a place for that. At the same time, instead of trying to push our kids' exposure to the reality of the world off as far as possible, think about the opportunity that encountering different morals, encountering different lifestyles, encountering different worldviews in your home can provide. Right? I mean, maybe your kid's first interaction with somebody who smokes pot doesn't have to be in a random park or behind the bleachers at school. Right? Maybe their first interaction can be in your home, where you have an opportunity. I mean, not the actual smoking pot in your home, but maybe it could be, but maybe your interaction with somebody who's different from you can be in your home, where you can talk to them about decision making, right? Where you can talk to them about priorities. Where you can talk about how we make this. Right? Maybe your kid's first interaction with someone who's gay won't be in middle school or high school, hallways, but in your house, where you can process together the difference between what the world says and what the Bible says, and you can model compassion and care. Maybe your kid's first interaction with somebody who hates Christians doesn't have to be in a college classroom, but can be across your kitchen table, where you get to model how to interact with somebody who's totally misunderstood, people like us, right? And it's a case-by-case, and it's a moment-by-moment decision, but I want to plant the seed that maybe the decision is a little bit more complicated than just, you know what, I can't do that, I got kids, right? What are they going to think? Those are important questions to ask, and I hope that they think and they see in us somebody like Jesus, right? I mean, think about the story of Jesus hanging out in Matthew's house. Preston actually happened to mention this yesterday. Matthew 9, Jesus reclined at the table in the house, and he went, after Matthew became a disciple, he reclined at Matthew's house, and a tax collector with all of Matthew's friends. He says, and many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, right? They're all just sitting around the table together. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. I think it's helpful for all of us to ask, who would I tend to be in this story? One of Jesus' disciples hanging out at the table? Or one of the Pharisees like looking in the window going like, whoa, wait, what's going on there? Right, wait, what about his reputation? hanging out with people like that. So get to know your neighbors, whoever they are. Do you realize that your neighbors were a loving choice made by a sovereign God, put in close physical proximity to you for a reason? It's not an accident. For some of you, this will mean stepping out of your comfort zone, and for many of us, it will. I think that's part of this call to put our light on a lampstand instead of hiding it under a basket. Moving beyond just knowing your neighbors, God also calls us to manifest our love in tangible action. Right? Our fourth is identify ways to serve your neighbors. Just identify ways to serve them. Right? 1 John 3, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Right? The parable of the Good Samaritan would not be near as famous if the Samaritan came by, stooped down, said, what's your name? Can I pray for you? Like, how'd this happen? Like, man, who jumped you? Like, where were you coming from? Where were you going? And like getting the story and being like, okay, well, I'll see ya, and walked away, right? The power of the Good Samaritan is that after all of that, he did something. He sacrificed his time, he sacrificed his money to care for the person he came across in need. We're called to do more than simply talk about the light. We're called to be the light. What are the ways that you could demonstrate radical, sacrificial love of Christ to your neighbors? Like, do you even know? Which is what leads us to this step. Identify ways to serve your neighbors, to care for them and love them. Just last week, I had such an encouraging picture of this, actually, just last week, because as I was studying this and preparing for this message, I was thinking through some of these things, and just as I regularly do, I was praying actually for our neighbors, and I was praying for one of our neighbors in particular who's been really struggling with a health issue. And I came home after thinking about them and praying for them and just asked Laura, I said, hey, is there anything we can do for them, right? Is there anything we can do? To which she said, oh, well, I already made double dinner and took it over to them. Like, they already had it. And I was like, oh, awesome. I'm like, is there like a calendar or something like that we can sign up? She's like, no. She's like, I just knew that's what they needed, right? And she wasn't like trying to make some like point. She was kind of trying to be like, no, I got it. Like, let's go take care of the kids, right? But it was this is such an encouraging picture to me, because I think, do you know how hard it is to answer the question, what do you need? Right? I mean, when you're in the midst of struggling or pain and somebody says, well, what can I do for you? You know how like almost impossible that question is to answer? Like, none of us want to answer that question. I don't want to try to figure out what you can do and figure out a way to tell you. I just want you to know. Right? I want you to know me well enough to at least like know something that like could help me, other than just leaving it up to me to, in the midst of my struggle, in the midst of my pain, figure it out for you. You know, and that's what we can be for our neighbors, even with very called to be, I was going to say relatively little sacrifice, but even when it does come at great sacrifice, this is what it's called to put our lamp on a lampstand. See, somehow, somewhere along the way, Christians got this idea that it was our holiness and our righteousness that were the light that we're supposed to show off, right? That somehow, if I show everybody how righteous I am, then they'll want Jesus. Right? So that's where we'd be like, right, okay, I'll interact with the world, but only in ways that show how good I am and how I have everything together and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, it does communicate something to my neighbors that I don't cheat on my wife. Right? It does communicate something that I don't come stumbling drunk out of the front and I'm swearing at my kids, right? It communicates something. So it's not that holiness is nothing. Holiness is, in that sense, our growth in Christ's likeness is the foundation upon which all of this, right, gets demonstrated. But at its core, it's not impressive to be a good rule follower, right? There's lots of those. What shines the light of Christ is our compassionate love our sacrificial service, and our genuine care for our neighbors, which, to be honest, in you and in me is impossible without Jesus. Right? That kind of love that without Jesus, I just wouldn't ever actually do. But because of Jesus, I can, and because of Jesus, I will. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning of this series, right? In order to make disciples, you have to first be a disciple, right? You can't fake this. You can't, and when we try to fake this love to our neighbors, that's when it's so transparent. And that's why people get turned off by Christians, right? Because they're like, I'm here to bring you food. Did you know about Jesus? Because I'm trying to check these things off my list, the steps that my church told me I was supposed to do, right? That's not what God's called us. What God's called us to is to be disciples first, to be so transformed that our heart breaks for those around us. We actually care about those around us, and our neighborhoods begin to transform simply because they have somebody in it who knows how to be a good friend. Our apartment buildings start to change because there's somebody in them that just knows how to be a good friend. The only way we can reflect the light of Christ is by living daily dependent on Him, having our heart transformed, praying both for our neighbors and also praying for ourselves that God would continue the work He's doing in us. So how are you reflecting the light of Christ? Take a look at your map again. Ask the question. I did this week. I was thinking about this. I'm like, okay, how brightly is the light shining in my neighborhood? Right? What's going on? I mean, you can even think about it you use the moon analogy again. Think about the phases of the moon, right? If all of your neighbors, if you don't know anyone's name, then there is a new moon in your neighborhood, right? There's nothing shining, right? You might be there, but it is completely under the basket, right? If you know your neighbors' names, but that's it, then it's kind of like a crescent moon, right? There's crescent moon going on over here and over here. If you know your neighbors' names and a bit about their story, then it's kind of like a quarter moon, which is a little bit confusing because it's actually visually half the moon, but they call it a quarter moon. Okay, anyways. I learned all these things this week. I learned something else. You ready? It's coming. So I got to read it too. But if you know your neighbors well, you know how to serve them and are engaged in their life, then you're like a gibbous moon. You guys know what gibbous moon is? Yeah. A gibbous moon is somewhere between half and full. It's around 3/4 moon. It's called a gibbous moon. Apparently this is common terminology that I have never heard before. You're a gibbous moon. Right? But it leads to the question, right? What does a full moon, what would full moon shining in my neighborhood represent? And I told you there were 4 steps, but that was almost true. The truth is there's actually a 5th step. And many of you have been asking yourself this already. You're like, wait, we've been going for a while now, and he hasn't even mentioned the gospel at all. Wait, what about that part of making disciples? It's a great question. And if you haven't asked yourself, I'm just kidding. In order to be, got halfway through that and was like, you shouldn't be saying this. In order to be the light of the world, we also have to share the truth and introduce them to the ultimate light, right? Which invite them to know not just the reflected light, but to know the source of that light in Jesus. And that is a huge part of that. But that's basically the 5th step is what we're going to talk about next week. That's what we're going to dive into kind of in full next week. But these really are kind of 2 sides of the coin. Because you can't make disciples by serving people and knowing people this way and not actually sharing and inviting them to know the source of the light. But on the flip side of the coin, you also can't make disciples just by saying truth, just by speaking truth, and not actually investing in their lives, showing, incarnating Christ to them, being His hands and His feet here on earth. And so we wanted to spend this week looking at this side of the coin, and we're going to spend next week looking at the other side. So as you, as we go, the thing that left me thinking even this week was just recognizing the people in my life who've been this type of light for me, right? If you're here, that's happened. If you're here, there'll be people who've been that light in your life. Maybe when you didn't know Christ, maybe in the midst of the process, in the process of you knowing Christ. But that's why you and I live where we live. That's why we work where we work. That's why we know who we know. Because God has placed us there to not be buried under a basket, whether it's this one or any other, but to put that light on a lampstand. So let me pray. Father, we are overwhelmed by your grace and your light and your love in our lives. Father, will you continue to transform us? Lord, will you continue to just show us opportunities? Lord, help us to be attentive to opportunities to love those around us, particularly our very physical neighbors. God, will you, I just think of how incredibly and how radically you could even just transform our city through each of us walking faithfully in little ways in these relationships. Father, our heart breaks for the loneliness and the discouragement and the frustration and the falsehood and the just put on happiness, Lord, that just is all over our city. God, our city longs for something real. And we know what it is, Lord. Help us not to hide that. Help us not to keep others in the dark, Lord, but to be who you've called us to be, the salt and light of the earth. Thank you. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.